Welcome to the London Politica podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Chawla, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Fabrice Pothier. Fabrice is the CEO of Rasmussen Global, a political consultancy that advises democratic governments and companies on some of the world's most challenging markets. He's also the former head of policy planning at NATO, a role that he held under two Secretary Generals. Fabrice, it is so wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Manas.
Fabrice, I think one of the reasons I was so keen to talk to you is because Rasmussen Global, in many ways, is not your average political consultancy. The namesake of your company is a former NATO Secretary General. Just a quick look on social media. I mean, you and your team seem to regularly meet with top Ukrainian officials, in fact, with President Zelensky himself. So tell me a bit more about sort of you and your company's work and how it differs from some of the other players possibly in that transatlantic policy space.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Rasmussen Global is unusual in the sense that this is a public affairs firm, but that we like to say we make choices, and we like to think we make the right choices, which is, for example, only working with sovereign democratic governments, which is really a very clear line we have set from the start. And as well as when it comes to, let's say, broader private sector issues, to always work on those transformative issues, on these transition issues that basically will make our societies and economies, or mostly the open economies and societies, better. So we work a lot, for example, on the green transition, the energy transition. We also work on space technology and the space sector, all those things that are important to make the Greater West stronger and better.
Yeah. And I mean, let's kick things off just talking about Ukraine. That's been the bread and butter of your work, perhaps, for the last sort of 2 years or so. I mean, what is the state of play right now? Because just about a day ago, we've seen key allies like France and Germany saying they might be open to, Ukraine striking certain military targets inside Russia. That's something that's been off the table for now. But how does this potentially change the state of play going into the future?
Well, I think it's a very clear question that brings a pretty big answer, because obviously the picture is not, one-dimensional. But the bottom line here, because you refer to what some of the allies are saying right now about undoing some of the restrictions put on some weapons that were provided to the Ukrainians, I think this is a sad story of us constantly being late by 6 or 12 months in terms of responding to Russian escalation, because of the own restrictions we put on ourselves, and obviously that we put on the Ukrainians. The result is you've got the Ukrainians who are fighting. We're asking Ukrainians to fight with their right hand in their back, and they only have their left hand to fight against basically a pretty, resilient, adaptive nuclear power. And actually, if you put it into that context, you can say Ukrainians have done pretty well. I'm not sure many NATO allies would have done so well. But obviously, it's not enough. It's not enough for Ukraine to be sure that it will remain as an independent sovereign country. And for that, we obviously have to remove some of the self-imposed restrictions, which are actually self-defeating for us and for the Ukrainians. And I think we have to go even further in guaranteeing Ukraine's future in the broader West. And for that, EU membership is essential, but actually key to the EU membership and to everything else is the NATO membership.
Yeah. Sort of in the follow-up to, potential NATO membership, you and your team have recently laid out some other recommendations to help the situation on the ground. One of those that sort of caught my eye was that you recommended all NATO allies devote at least 0.25% of their GDP. But, sort of a quick look at the Kiel Institute tracker. I mean, most of Western Europe doesn't currently do that. France, that's sort of making some of these bold claims about Ukraine attacking Russian military sites. It only currently devotes about half of what you're recommending. Same for sort of Spain, Portugal, other parts of Western Europe where the real money is, some might say. So what means does Ukraine really have it at its disposal to still lobby Europe to invest more in Ukrainian security?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Manas. I think this is a game of us not going beyond the good enough. And you have to put that into the broader confrontation we are in. You have, on one hand, Russia that is dedicating 7% of its GDP to the war economy and to the war effort. It's actually not sustainable. And that's why Vladimir Putin has put an economist in charge of the Ministry of Defense, because this is like really putting the Russian economy on steroids. And you have to imagine with all the corruption that is involved in the Putin system. So there's a real problem that there are going to be many cracks in the system. However, with that 7%, which is quite considerable, he's not managed to yet fully occupy the Donbass. And he's at it since 2014. We have to remember that. It's not the invasion started in 2022. It started in 2014. So it's to say you've got a country that has mobilized a lot of wealth and is not yet fulfilling its full objective. And on the other hand, we have us who are actually doing too little. And if we were to do just a bit more, and we talked about 0.25% of our defense spending that should go to Ukraine, if we were to do that, it will outnumber Russia. So I think it's about being confident about our size and our scale. But what you see in the West, with few exceptions, is we've lost that courage. We've lost that confidence about ourselves and about knowing this is something that is obviously worth winning. And to win, we need to make the extra, go the extra mile and make the extra effort. So this is where our work with President Zelensky and his team is coming into play, because we are working with them very closely to argue, obviously, in their favor for a greater Western support, because I think we know what the elements of success are. It's just that for the moment, we're not giving ourselves the means of this success. And to respond to your specific point of France, you're absolutely right. You've got the French leadership that says now, after a year and a half of, I think, being on the wronger, I would say, not necessarily the right side of the question, but now saying all the right things, talking about strategic ambiguity, talking about even having some trainers on the ground, really saying, ticking all the boxes of what you want our leaders to say. And yet France is spending no more than Lithuania. And when I tell that to my French colleagues, they obviously get quite nervous and offended, but these are the facts. These are the Kiel Institute number, and they don't lie. And the fact is France doesn't put the means to its ambitions. And if France wants to be heard and followed, I think France is now more heard than before, but is not followed, they have to be willing to put the resources behind their statement. And that's a discrepancy. And then on the other hand, and that's the paradox, you've got Germany that is putting real resources on the table. I mean, we're talking about something like up to 20 billion euro of military aid. Who will afford that? Germany, including with a SPD, with a social democrat chancellor, will have done that. But yet you have that same chancellor who is talking about being a peace chancellor, who is unwilling to deliver the kind of long-range weapons the Ukrainians need that the other allies, like the British, the French, the Americans, have delivered. So that's the great paradox we're in, especially in Europe, where you've got those who say the right thing but not necessarily do the right things, and those who do the right things but don't say the right things.
Yeah, yeah. That point about France and Lithuania is really interesting. In fact, a few months ago, we had former NATO Assistant Secretary General, Giedrimas Jeglinskas, on the podcast, and he's a colleague of yours as well, who made the same point.
I saw him in Copenhagen last week. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. When you sort of talk about NATO membership and this country's attitudes towards NATO membership, I mean, you've been on the very inside of shaping some of these narratives. I saw an interview with you 10 months ago on CNBC saying NATO isn't ready to welcome Ukraine. We're now in May, sort of end of May of 2024. Would you still say the same?
Well, sadly, having been to Washington over the past few weeks to actually argue the case for an invitation, a NATO invitation for Ukraine to become down the line a member, I think the line has not moved, especially in Washington and Berlin. Unfortunately, this is for the wrong reason. The view in Washington and in Berlin is that this will be escalatory, that NATO is not ready to absorb a country that is at war with Russia. And whilst, we have to listen to that, and there's some truth to it, invitation is not membership. You can have many years between the invitation point and the membership point. But invitation signals a real commitment, because, Manas, just to take a step back here, this is not a war that is going to be won with bombs and missiles and drones. These are means, but the war is going to be won by demonstrating a greater will, a greater commitment than the opposite side. Vladimir Putin is committed to try to achieve more, even though he's not going to be able to achieve everything he wanted, which is to subdue the whole of Ukraine. But he wants to grab a bit more, and he wants to get some kind of neutral Ukraine that is half sovereign or something like this. We have to show that our commitment to a free, independent, sovereign Ukraine is stronger than his commitment. And the NATO invitation is that signal. So this is where, even though the dial has not moved, despite at least in some key capitals, I think the argument is very clear. And just to nuance that, what's interesting, we have never had such a stronger majority in the North Atlantic Council in favor of Ukraine's membership to NATO, including my own country, which I was criticizing a few minutes ago, France, which normally is a kind of membership skeptic. For all things to do with NATO membership, is actually now in favor, and in favor sooner rather than later. The United Kingdom, the same. So this was not the case a few years ago. So I think there's a growing consensus that this is the way to go, and this is the way to go as soon as possible. But you still have the two, I would say, most pivotal powers at NATO on this question, the United States and Germany, who are not there yet. But I'm confident we can convince them down the line that this is the best way to start ending this war.
Yeah. Let me just unpack sort of one thing you said there, something, the idea that this war necessarily won't be won by sort of bombs and rockets, but rather commitment and political commitments are a large part of it. I think there's one view simply saying, in very basic terms, that this is a war of attrition, right? It's just about who has the bigger military industrial complex. And here on the one side, you have Russia that is producing 3 times more shells than Ukraine and its European allies and the United States combined. A Russia that has 4 times more manpower going into the summer than Ukraine does. And a disparity that doesn't look likely to change perhaps, anytime soon. So lots of people might look at that and say, until you can get any of those numbers down or sort of change the actual state of play in this war of attrition, the military facts on the ground won't change. And insofar as those facts won't change, the only real solution is a political solution, negotiated solution, where perhaps Ukraine has to give up some of its territory to Russia. I mean, how do you see that narrative changing? And is that a view that, how much of that do you agree with?
That's a really important question, because it's about what are the indicators to success or victory? What are the resources you need to put Ukraine basically in a position where it can be ending this war on acceptable terms? And I think it's not one or the other. You need to have some form of parity in the military domain. Ukraine needs, to be able to defend itself and its most critical cities and infrastructure, that's sure. And that's why Putin is exerting huge pressure on the second largest city, Kharkiv. So for sure that we need to do much better in providing them with the military equipment, the missiles, the bombs, the artillery shells, to be able to hold the line. So I think but this is not going to be enough, because Russia has also a real strategic depth. If Ukraine's strategic depth is up, and we need to do better at that, Russia's strategic depth is its own territory, its access unlimited critical raw materials, and also the alliance of Russia with China, North Korea, and Iran. So I think we will not just be winning at the quantitative game. We need to also win the qualitative game. And the qualitative game is our firm commitment, irreversible commitment that Ukraine is in, that Ukraine is no longer in this kind of geopolitical ambiguity that Putin keeps on exploiting since 2014.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'd love to know from your recent trip to Washington, I mean, a lot of the future of Ukraine hinges on the political future of the United States. We've got, American elections coming up towards mid-November, just a few months away now. And that could change perhaps the entire calculus of the war. In my view, nobody really knows what a Trump presidency would look like for Ukraine, other than it'd be a lot worse than what's happening right now. How likely, firstly, do you see a Trump presidency? And secondly, I mean, if you were to do a situation analysis like you might do for some of your clients, what are the likely situations at hand heading into, say, the beginning of next year under President Trump?
I have a great respect for President Biden. I've had the privilege of working with him a few years ago when he was ex-vice president and not yet running for president. He's a real transatlantic. I think he's a real leader like the United States can produce from time to time. He's passed legislation that no other president in recent time has passed. So I think kudos to him. Yet I came back from Washington actually depressed about what the current administration is thinking about Ukraine. And I came back actually slightly more optimistic about what the Trump administration might be doing. And this is by talking to people who are obviously part of I would say, the ecosystem of both sides. And the reality is the Democrats are, I think, setting themselves for a very iterative way of managing this war. And with this funding that will kind of keep on repeating itself with the usual political problems. But my argument to them is to say, but here you are basically signing a check for an open-ended war, which is very hard to see how more of the same is going to fundamentally change the outcome. And the outcome for the moment is not good for Ukraine. So I'm worried that the Democrats, with the best intentions of the world, that they have managed to keep some unity in the West and to rally the West, the greater West, including Japan. But yet it's not enough. It's not delivering enough strength. And it's not laying out a path to how to finish that. And our interest, starting with the Ukrainians, is to finish that on acceptable terms. Whilst on the other hand, the Republicans, what I'm hearing is a notion that we need more leverage. We need to be able to lean on Putin to get him to kind of start seeing that he has to finish this. He has to accept terms that might not be his terms and that might also not be 100% Ukraine's terms, but there has to be a settlement. And what's important is obviously nobody can predict President Trump if first he's going to be reelected, even though his chances look pretty good so far. And nobody can predict exactly how he's going to play that game with Putin. But there's one thing that drives Donald Trump. He doesn't want to be a loser. He's driven by this notion that he's got to look good. He's got to look like a winner. And losing could mean basically Ukraine collapsing. So he will not, I think, do a deal that could put the ingredients for Ukraine collapse. He will want to have a deal, if it gets there, that actually will show that Ukraine can be successful and that it's a win-win. So I think this is the key, that if there is to be a future Republican administration, they will have to think, what is the strength that is going to kind of make Putin change posture and realize that he has to stop using weapons and start to use negotiations? And what are the terms that are going to make Ukraine sufficiently successful so even the United States and Donald Trump can do good and they have succeeded in their mission?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's a really interesting point you make, almost a personal one about Donald Trump not wanting to be seen as a loser. And I think that's totally correct. I just think that, if you look at some of the things that happened during his first term, a lot of the things that he did made him perhaps look like not a loser to his very particular political base, but perhaps for in grand, maybe geopolitical terms for the United States, a losing option. For instance, the conference with North Korea and South Korea perhaps achieved nothing very substantial. Replaced NAFTA with the USMCA, nothing substantial. So
you're right, because here I think on North Korea the mistake is that Trump believed that the leverage was himself.
Yeah.
The magic, Trump magic, enough to hypnotize even a nasty leader and to get him to kind of be willing. But that's obviously not enough. And that's why actually, thank God, the people around him hold him back and say, you can't sign this because basically you are giving away all our leverage. So that's one thing. But on Ukraine, actually the Trump administration was far better for Ukraine than the previous administration. I was in Washington with the Obama administration. We were arguing for javelins to be provided to the Ukrainians who were not in a frozen conflict, were in a small scale but still a significant conflict along the contact line. And the Obama administration refused to do so. It's actually the Trump administration that delivered the javelins to the Ukrainians. It's the Trump administration and the Congress under the Trump administration that passed stronger sanctions against Russia. And that was all before 2022, before the Second War. launched by Vladimir Putin against Ukraine. So actually, it's not just Trump; it's also the people around him, like Mattis and his national security team. But I think it does, Trump on foreign policy front, they don't do everything wrong. And I tend to agree with him on the fact that the European allies need to be much more serious about spending money on defense.
Yeah.
Even though he frames it in a way that I think it can be undermining NATO's credibility, but he's right in some aspects that the Europeans need to be more serious about what they have, their obligations. And then finally, the other bit of foreign policy, like global foreign policy, that the Trump administration got right is the China question. China was seen as a secondary, benign question in Europe at the time. And under Trump, it became a much more strategic question. And I think a lot of eyes got open during the Trump administration in Europe that China is not a benign actor, that China has an economic and in some case military agenda, both in the region, but even in Europe, and that you need to be much more hard-headed about it. And that, I think, kudos to not just personally Donald Trump, but his administration to have raised it and put that on top of the agenda.
Yeah. Fabrice, usually my last question is, what leaves you sort of optimistic about whatever situation we're discussing? But I think we've naturally kind of come to that conclusion, perhaps, that, potentially a Trump administration might not be all the doom and gloom that sort of the Western neoliberal establishment fears that it might be for the West and for Ukraine. There might be some bright spots there. Such a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Manas.